Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for modern Latin American history. Today we're going to continue our discussion of independence and revolution by looking at a very different form that revolution will take in Latin America. Previously, we discussed what motivated the first sparks of independence against European rule. That spark was actually set in Europe, where Napoleon Bonaparte and his armies were marching across the continent, deposing kings and princes and replacing them with members of his own family. In 1808, his armies marched through Spain, driving the Spanish king Ferdinand VII from power. Napoleon quickly replaced Ferdinand with his brother, Joseph Bonaparte. But across the ocean, Spain's colonies refused to recognize Joseph Bonaparte as the Spanish king. They demanded the return of Ferdinand VII to the throne, and they refused to cooperate with the colonial government until that happened. In 1814, they got what they wanted. Napoleon was defeated and driven from power. So the revolution in America ends, right? Wrong. Instead, something funny happens. Some of the wealthy Creoles in America began thinking that independence might be a good thing. They based their argument on the concept of nativism. Nativism is similar to our concept of nationalism today. In short, people should govern themselves, rather than be ruled by a distant king or emperor. This divides the Peninsulars from the Creoles. Creoles typically support nativism. Peninsulars do not. But this was only one revolution that was brewing in the colonies at this time. The second type of revolution was very different. It was a revolution of fringe versus elite. Fringe versus urban, of elite versus the poor. Now let's look at these two regions to better understand how their revolutions against Spanish rule were different. First of all, urban Latin America was the center of wealth and power in the colonies. It's also where most Peninsulars and Creoles lived. That's no surprise given that these are the two elite groups in Latin American society. It's natural that they would want to be close to the wealth and the power. Moreover, because this is where elites dominate, it's also the area where Spanish culture is dominant. This can be seen in the language and the architecture. In contrast, the rural areas had fewer elites, and therefore less power and less wealth. Instead, it was an area dominated by the mestizos and by indigenous peoples. Moreover, this is where native cultures remained strong. Indigenous languages dominated, as did traditional foods and clothing. Now, another difference between these two areas is what drove the people to revolt. Excuse me. This slide tells the story in a nutshell. The conservative revolution being pushed by the Creoles wanted to preserve the traditional power structure of colonial society. Creoles simply wanted to replace the Peninsulars as the elites that would be in charge. The radical revolution that was occurring on the fringe, however, wanted the opposite. They wanted to completely overturn the traditional power structure that had oppressed them and kept them poor and without rights for years. One example of the fringe revolution will break out in what is now northern Mexico. It all began with this man, Father Miguel Hidalgo y Castillo. Father Hidalgo, as he was known, was assigned to the poor community of mestizos and Indians in northern Mexico. In 1810, he rallied the poor in the tiny village of Dolores to fight for their deposed king, Ferdinand VII. In other words, Hidalgo's revolution begins the same way that the elite revolution begins. But that is where the similarities end, as Hidalgo went beyond simply calling for the return of Ferdinand VII. The speech that Hidalgo delivered is what is now known as the Cry of Dolores. No one knows what Hidalgo said exactly, but this rendering probably comes close. It was a message crafted to appeal to the poor and the oppressed. Now, how can we tell that? Well, let's consider who Hidalgo was talking to first. He lives in Dolores, a city on the fringe. Who lives on the fringe? As I said, this is a fringe community, so it's dominated by the indigenous and by the mestizos. They would be the poorest of the poor in Mexico. Now, where do we see this in Father Hidalgo's message? In other words, where do we see an appeal to the poor and an appeal to the indigenous in these words? Well, let's look at these lines. Will you free yourselves? Will you recover the land stolen 300 years ago from your forefathers by the hated Spaniards? Long live Our Lady of Guadalupe! Death to bad government! Excuse me. These are words that are meant to appeal to an oppressed people. They describe lands stolen by the Spanish. Moreover, the reference to Our Lady of Guadalupe, aka the Virgin of Guadalupe, is another reference designed to appeal to the poor. Remember, the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared to an indigenous peasant. She is a symbol that is most revered by those at the bottom of society. Finally, death to bad government refers to the centralized rule of the Peninsulars in Mexico. These people have dominated Mexican society while neglecting the poor communities on the fringe for centuries. Finally, there is this line: death to the Gachupines. Gachupines, if you look it up, means settlers from Spain. In other words, Peninsulars. Now, let's look more closely at the revolution that Father Hidalgo sparks. Thousands of indigenous in mestizos will flock to his side. This number ultimately will swell to 90,000 as more and more angry Indians and mestizos take up the cause. The symbol of the movement was the Virgin of Guadalupe, which emblazoned the banners carried by the mob. Their goal was simple: to overturn the social structure. In other words, they're really not concerned with putting Ferdinand VII back on the throne in Spain any longer. Instead, what they want now is to kill the Peninsulars. That's evident in their cry, "Death to the Gachupines." When Hidalgo's army, armed with machetes and farm tools, approached the mining city of Guanajuato, the local peninsular population took refuge in a massive grain bin. Hidalgo laid siege to the city and eventually took it. At this point, the army of Indians and mestizos made good on their promise of death to the Gachupines. Hundreds were massacred, and Hidalgo's army continued to grow. But the massacre didn't stop with the Peninsulars. Hidalgo's army tended to view all rich Spaniards as Peninsulars. That included wealthy Creoles living in Guanajuato. The poor proceeded to loot, pillage, and murder their way through town. This scene repeated itself a month later in Guanajuato. This time, however, Hidalgo's soldiers beheaded their prisoners. The result of these attacks was to convince both Creoles and Peninsulars that Hidalgo and his followers were a threat to everyone. They banded together to fight the growing revolution. At the same time, Hidalgo's army began to dwindle. He discovered that while the Indians and mestizos were willing to fight for their homes, their interest in revolution declined the farther they got from home. Hidalgo's army began to disappear, and the Spanish were able to stop and defeat the remaining force. Hidalgo was ultimately captured and beheaded in 1811. The movement that Hidalgo started, however, did not end with Hidalgo. Instead, another man, José María Morelos, will take up the cause of Hidalgo's revolution. Morelos fought with Hidalgo, and in many ways they were very, very similar. Morelos was a priest, for example. Unlike Hidalgo, however, Morelos was a mestizo. He also lived on the fringe in the state of Michoacán. This is, of course, a fringe region of Mexico. In September of 1813, he gave a speech at a meeting of those calling for Mexican independence. In that speech, he declares, "The spirit of Montezuma, Cacamatz, Cuauhtémoc, Zicontacate, and Calzontkin take pride in this august assembly and celebrate this happy moment in which your sons have congregated to avenge your insults. After August 12, 1521, came September 8, 1813. The first date tightened the chains of slavery of Mexico, Tenochtitlan. The second one broke them forever in the town of Chilpancingo. We are therefore going to restore the Mexican Empire and improve the government. We are going to be free and independent." What stands out to you here? In what way is this speech similar to the cry of Dolores uttered by Hidalgo? Well, let's look at it more closely. Let's start with the first line where Morelos makes reference to a number of famous Aztec leaders. In other words, he is appealing to a pre-Columbian history of Mexico. Just as Hidalgo talks about how the Spanish had robbed the people of their lands, Morelos is also appealing to those who remember, or at least maybe they don't remember it, but they are romanticizing a past before the Spanish arrived. Here's another reference to the Aztecs. This is the date that Cortez will complete his conquest of the Aztec Empire, 1521. He also makes another reference. The first date tightened the chains of slavery of Mexico, Tenochtitlan. In other words, this is when the people of Mexico were first enslaved by the Spanish. Finally, here is Morelos' goal: to restore the Mexican or Aztec Empire. This sounds almost like nativism, America for Americans, that is being trumpeted by some revolutionaries. In another document, Morelos will lay out the principles of his revolution. One of those points was to create a government where everyone was equal before the law. In other words, Morelos is calling for an end to the caste system, an end to this system where one's rights and where one's responsibilities depended on the color of your skin. In 1815, however, Morelos will be captured by the Spanish and executed. The push for independence does not end with Morelos' death, however. Instead, it will morph into something else. Now, let's recap for a second on the two revolutions that we have discussed thus far this semester. On the one hand, there was the conservative revolution of Peninsulars versus Creoles. Initially, these two groups worked together to put Ferdinand VII back on the throne. However, it quickly turns into a revolution of Creoles versus Peninsulars, as Creoles seek to drive out the Peninsulars and take over their position as elites leading Latin American society. A far more radical revolution is going to take place on the fringe, however. This is a revolution of indigenous and mestizos versus elites. This is a revolution that seeks to completely overturn the traditional power structure in Latin American society. So, how is independence in Latin America finally achieved? Well, that's going to be the subject of our next lecture. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, once again, email me, give me a call, stop by my office, or we can talk about these things in class. Thank you very much.